tonight. So I will, in some ways, give you a preparation for what's going to happen tonight. And I do that in two ways. So I will give you a primer in the second half on the Copyright and Digital Single Market Directive. Because Kathleen Styler, who will speak tonight, who's now the Chief Executive of the Open Knowledge Foundation, she was the Vice Chair of the Internal Market Committee in the European Parliament during the process. Okay, so she was a policy actor, and she will speak about her experience in shaping that directive, which was adopted in April last year. And has been hugely controversial. And she will speak particularly on what has now become Article 17, which is a change in the liability of platforms. Any of you have heard about that? Yeah? I think the Germans will have heard about the demonstrations. It was then Article 13, so there was quite a lot actually of street action. And it's a kind of a new paradigm in that it, up to now, the liability for platforms, for user-generated content uploaded to the platform, lies with the user. And the platform only becomes liable if they don't take it down after they've been notified. So it's the knowledge which matters, okay? So under the new proposal, it will switch to something for certain content providers, the ones which offer sharing content, and YouTube is the paradigm here. They will become directly liable for the content uploaded by the users. Okay, they will be treated as a communication to the public. So that's quite a big paradigm change how platforms are treated in copyright law, and it has potential to reverberate into many other areas. So it's quite a critical moment. So before I go there, I want to do some work on something which is here written down in quite complicated words. Okay, so what might we mean by the juridification of the policy process, and particularly the European context, the politics of judicial integration? Okay, so if you've done some of the preparatory reading, this should be clear, but it's not an easy concept. So what do we mean by the juridification of the policy process? It points to the role courts play in the policy process, doesn't it? So,
do you like the courts define the policy?
Yeah. So normally we would think, politicians, democratic structures decide policy, and the courts implement them, enforce them. Okay. What we have in the European space is sometimes the other way around. So there are norms which are a bit opaque, ambiguous, and then the court, the European Court of Justice, as the highest court of the European Union, will take it upon themselves to make decisions which politicians can't make. Okay, so politicians find it difficult because it's a contested area, there's conflicts, and then they stand back and they have some compromise text adopted at the European level, and then it's left to the court basically to say where policy is going. So that gives courts a role which is quite unlike normal courts, and it's important to understand that's possible. It's not Europe is not unique in that. In most democratic countries, the highest courts, the constitutional courts, they often seem to play a role of this kind. So they will look at implications for society, and they will not just offer a doctrinal decision. They will have a wider view of what's good for society. They may not say it in these terms, they have to articulate it in terms of the law, but the view is that the higher you go in the court system, the more the courts are prepared to do that. So that politics in some ways enters the court system. And in your view, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It goes a little bit against what we've been taught. If you're a lawyer, when you go to your client, you're not supposed to say, oh, you know, my political views are this, and you know, you're supposed to reason. But you know, so do you have a view on this? Yeah.
I think it goes kind of against the separation of powers. Because I think, like, the legislature is sometimes supposed to do policy.
So the legislator has the democratic mandate, I assume. But the judiciary has some function in controlling that. I think that would go together with the separation of powers. But no, it's an argument. You must have thought about this. I'm sure you have.
I think sometimes, because of how the legislative process works, you have very old laws which aren't really applied so much anymore. Because society has changed so much, it might be unjust to apply for the death judiciary being sort of act as a stopping power basically.
So if courts wouldn't do that, they would lose legitimacy in society. So if society as a whole changes, you know, the courts can't respond at all. It causes a potential issue for legitimacy. And I think you're right that, you know, just observing how countries develop, you know, courts do tend to, over time, they're rarely ahead, but mostly they go with the flow. Anybody's got worries here? I mean, what's the obvious worry if the court adopts this kind of role?
Well, there's no direct oversight from the public and the population over the courts in the way that, in theory, there is over politicians who you can recall elections.
Yeah. So in some ways it goes against the independence and the fact that they don't have a direct mandate. Yeah. And that, you know, legal reasoning is supposed to be a kind of self-contained system, you know, of logic. Okay, so in our field, intellectual property rights, and particularly in copyright law, there has been something quite unusual in that we had essentially no copyright references to the highest European court, and then there was suddenly an explosion, and now we've had over the last 10 years, I think, 90 cases, okay, 90 copyright cases at the highest European court, okay. So I mean that's quite something. So in this project, what I did try to understand with my two collaborators is, you know, what is happening here. So what's happening here, and we wanted to address precisely this question. You know, does the court take a role which it is not due, and how does it shape copyright policy and jurisprudence at European level? And if you take that approach, you know, you have to look at the court as a social phenomenon. Judges which sit there, a case which go there as opinions, as texts. So you don't look at it as a legal text, you look at it as a social phenomenon. And that's what we try to do in these two papers I gave you. And what we found pretty quickly is that there are patterns. So these are, you know, the cases for references up to 2012. What you find is that there are certain judges who decide a lot of the cases. So Malinovsky, the Czech representative on the court, I think has decided 3/4 of copyright cases. I mean, not decided. He's written he's the so-called rapporteur. So he's written the decision, but in the European court there's no dissent. Okay, so So you don't know whether there was a disagreement about it or not, unlike in many other court settings. So we don't know whether some judges didn't support it or not. If there's a majority of us voting it, then it is the ruling. And we also found that they pair the Advocate General with the same judges quite often. So I don't know how much you know of the European system. I think it's a good example to explain it to you. So a reference to the highest European court happens if a national court is not sure about the meaning of a concept which derives from European law. Okay? So you've got a whole body of European law, the acquis, and directives, regulations. And if there is ambiguity, uncertainty about the meaning of certain concepts which derive from European legislation, the national court does not know how to interpret it, they pose a question up to the court. Okay? And these are called preliminary references. They always come from courts. And then the court doesn't have a view on the facts of the case. They basically will say, this is a autonomous European concept, which they often say. If they give them a chance to say, is this a autonomous European concept, means it should have the same meaning across the European Union, then the court most of the time says yes. And then it defines the meaning of the concept and passes it back to the national court. And the national court then applies that meaning to the facts of the case. Okay? So that's how the system works. So the decisions of the European Court of Justice are mostly quite short and quite formulaic. So more elaborate reasoning is found in the so-called Advocate General's opinion. The Advocate General is, again, there's a body of lawyers which are appointed from the member states to the court, and they're supposed to take the view of the European Union as a whole. So they basically make a recent case to the judiciary how they should decide from a perspective of the European Union. So they advise the chamber. Okay? So that's the best way to look at the role of the Advocate General. So the Advocate General is more familiar to the type of legal reasoning you are probably familiar with, in that they cite cases and there's something like jurisprudence which you can follow, while often the decisions itself, they repeat sentences from past decisions and they can be quite formulaic. Okay. So the literature had a worry about this, escalation of references to the ECJ, and the two main ones which surfaced is that essentially what the court says is unpredictable. So there's no coherent body of jurisprudence relating to copyright emerging. They may have done 70 or 90 decisions, at the time 70. But it's impossible to kind of see a coherent reasoning with which then forms a jurisprudence. The way a legal system becomes applicable, and where then the whole profession of lawyers knows how to deal with certain concepts. And the second worry in the literature is that essentially it's on a power grab. So there is a harmonizing and upward lifting agenda behind it. So if there's a choice, the court will appropriate the concept and it will ratchet up protection. Okay, because it's easier to go up than down. So these are the kind of two views in the literature, so which we set out to test. And we tried to do that through 4 sets of empirical data. So firstly, the processes, so are there patterns in the allocation of cases? Secondly, the disciplinary background of the judges. So, do particular judges have particular views? If you take a political view of the court, that's what you might want to do. And in the US, it's completely done that way. essentially, each judge on the Supreme Court has a political profile. That's not the case at all in the European Union. They are up to now completely kind of under the radar. The names are not known. I'm sure none of you knows any single name of a judge on the court unless you've read our papers. And so they are not perceived to be political at this moment, but there may still be a difference in leanings and in disciplinary background, which may influence the way they find cases. And so this is looking really, as I said, as the court as a social phenomenon. So how does it work? Who makes the decisions? The second part then that looks at the decisions as texts. So it doesn't look at them as legal documents, but as texts. So what type of patterns of reasonings are repeated? And are these patterns of reasonings linked to particular outcomes? So if you use some language from a particular recital, is that then always associated with a particular outcome finding in favor of a particular party? Okay. So this technique is called content analysis and has become suddenly quite popular. It has also become quite popular among litigating lawyers, because they feel if they understand how a court is likely to find, they can advise their clients better. So it's a double-edged sword. In some ways, I think for transparency, we should know how a court works. On the other hand, if now data analytic methods allows a law firm to predict, if we use this court and it goes to this judge, we have to use that argument and we'll get that outcome. Okay, so that's something which is would be worrying from a justice perspective. But it's a method which is increasingly out there. Any French people in the? So there's just been a proposed law, hasn't it, that in France that data analytic methods are becoming unlawful if applied to judicial decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an extreme countermeasure against. So what we have done, in fact, would potentially become unlawful in France. Yeah. Okay, so I don't need to spend too much time here. This is really just looks at which chambers. So the court sits either in grand chamber, and all the judges sit together. So these are the really important cases, or in the sorry, is this yeah, here we are. So the grand chamber here, you've got 20% of cases there. Of copyright cases, and only 9% of all cases going to the ECJ are in the grand chamber. So copyright law is a little bit more sensitive. So more copyright cases go to the full court than other areas of law. And but it's distributed among the chambers, and it turns out that not the same judges always sit in the same chambers. So the pattern here doesn't deliver you a lot. And you get kind of random variations in which chambers the copyright cases end up. So this doesn't say a lot either. But now it gets really interesting. So this is the Malinowski graph. So this is the judge rapporteur, and subject matter we divide by 3: data protection, software, and copyright. And you can see that. The database directive ones go to Lennartz, who is now the president of the court, and almost all copyright cases go to Malinowski. Okay, it has changed a little bit now, but he's still by far the dominant judge. So he's obviously an interesting guy to investigate with this method. Advocate generals. There's also a pattern, so certain advocate generals get certain cases repeatedly. But the pattern is not as extreme as it is for the judges. So, now we come to their disciplinary background. And you will see immediately that there is no private law, no commercial law, no intellectual property law expertise here. The judges at European level tend to be public law, administrative law judges, and I assume it's not surprising because European law is taught in that context, and sometimes there are former. The criteria is they would have to qualify to be appointed to the highest court in their home jurisdiction, otherwise they can't be nominated. And each member state of the European Union nominates one judge. There's a kind of a review process, but so they can be rejected, but essentially it's the member state which nominates. So that's a bit scary, isn't it? So you get intellectual law cases as a judge for the first time when you are, sitting there on the bench. And it's a highly technical, highly specialist area of law, and you have to make decisions which, affect the whole European Union, possibly for decades. And you're not an expert. So there are two views to take here. So one, it's probably a good thing because the public law is perspective is more about balancing, kind of. So have a kind of a fresh look at a field of law might be a good thing, and it's less open to capture by lobby. So that's the positive side. The other one is, essentially they don't know what they're doing, and because they don't know what they're doing, the outcome of cases is unpredictable. So we could have both arguments, and they're both legitimate. So while the criteria is that they should qualify for the highest court in their home jurisdiction, each country has different criteria here. So in the UK, you would not be appointed to the highest court coming from public administration, but in many countries that's possible. And that's what we call provenance. So this is where have they served before? So before they become judges at the highest European court, where did they serve? And so the most prominent provenance is the Court of Human Rights, the Strasbourg Court, which again is very interesting because human rights kind of reasoning is normally not one which is applied in private law, and the copyright law, having copyright cases decided for people with that background is introduces a new dimension. So this is what we found about the makeup of the court and the background of the judges. Now I move to the content analysis end. So in legal theory, there are basically three ways of reasoning, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. If you're interested in legal theory, that this is an interesting field. But essentially, semantic reasoning is the classic doctrinal method, which is you focus in your interpretation on the actual wording. The theological is the other end, which is you focus on the purpose of the law. Okay. So initially we had the idea that if it's true that the European courts adopts this harmonizing agenda, they probably will argue from the purpose of law, and therefore if you could find a difference between semantic and theological in the reasoning, then that would give them some insight how they arrive at their decisions. And the systematic one sits slightly in the middle, that that sets it in the light in the context of other treaties, and it's kind of intermediate position between semantic and theological. But what we found when we analyzed, and that's why you don't need to spend much time on it, is really if you quote the wordings in the decisions, which kind of patterns they use, there's really no interesting information. They use all of them. Yeah. And that both the Advocate General and the judges use semantic reasoning, which they would if they're lawyers. They use theological reasoning and they use systematic reasoning. And I'll just give you some of the examples how we would code text. So theological in the copyright context might refer to the purpose of harmonization, to the circulation of culture, to the high protection of authors, to fair competition, technological development, fair balance of rights, overcoming legal uncertainty, and adequate compensation. So these are all aims of the law. Okay, so they're not kind of texts which are in the substantive provisions of the article. And the systematic approach, they would look to legal history, to treaties set in the context of other directives, and put it in the context of fundamental law. Okay, so once we've done this first scan, we decided we needed to dig deeper, and we thought the theological line was the most promising, so we coded again and coded down all the theological arguments by those 2, 4, 6, 8 different, what we call topoi of reasoning. And there it started to become interesting. So here you can see now what type of arguments are used if the decision is in favor of right holders or users. So in order to see what the kind of political direction of the court is, we coded each question posed to the court, whether the answer would be favorable to right holders or to users, intermediaries. We only use those two categories. Essentially, are activities unlawful within the scope of exclusive rights or not? Essentially, that's the easiest way to draw the border. And what we see here is that if the court uses the arguments for the high protection of right holders or the author of the owner, in the recital, I think to the infrastructure directive it says high protection of the author. So if they cite the recital to the infrastructure directive, then most of the time they find in favor of the right holder. Okay, so that's not that surprising, isn't it? But we found that Malinowski has a slightly different way of approaching these topics. So if you look at all decisions where Malinowski has written and all decisions which the court has written which are not by Malinowski, you see that the types of reasoning is quite different. Okay? And what is typical of the Malinowski approach is a focus here on the fair balance of rights. So it means that's you could say it's a wishy-washy concept, but this introduces this kind of public law perspective into copyright law. That the balance of rights should be achieved. And also, interestingly enough, he sometimes cites the high protection for the owner when he finds against the owner. Okay, but that goes together with this balancing approach. It's quite surprising that you would, cite a recital supporting owners and then find against the owners. So it just shows, acknowledging that the balancing takes place and making it visible. Okay, so now these are the core findings. So on the hypothesis in the literature, does the ECJ lack coherence in copyright jurisprudence? This is all online, so you don't necessarily, if you find the material, it's on the slides you got, so don't worry about writing fast or taking photos. So the measure we found, yes, that there's no prior domain experience of the judges, so this points in the direction that there may be incoherence. And there are no specialist chambers. As a hypothesis, we reject that because we found that the cases are repeatedly allocated to the same judges and advocate generals. So while we don't know, there's no document about the process of the court which tells you what the basis on which cases are allocated. It's just the president decides. There is clearly a logic to it. So, we call it later judicial learning. So if the same judges get the same type of cases all the time, they over time become experts. And on the reasoning is unpredictable. Well, it seems to be yes, that the patterns of reasoning don't really link neatly with the outcomes of the cases. So which seems to suggest that it's hard to read what they're doing. But that's, it's a reasonably small sample. So because for each, if you quote each decision, then we end only up, with 5 or 6 decisions using a particular pattern, and then you can't really run any statistical analysis on it. So you can only say we see a pattern if that would be, found, in 150 observations, then it would be statistically significant. So we have to be careful what we say there. Then, does the court pursue an activist, upwardly harmonizing agenda? So we find the measure we looked at is, there's prevalence of theological content, and yes, we find that there is a tendency to use theological arguments, but they are, not to the exclusivity of the other patterns of reasoning. So that's inconclusive. And then the last one, the outcome of judgments expand copyright protection. There we found actually that the decisions are about 50-50 for copyright owners and users / intermediaries. So the court, while it may harmonize, it does not ratchet up protection. So this type of work had not been done before, so it's become quite a reference point in literature. It's was published in the Modern Law Review, which is the most prestigious of the UK law journals, so you might run into this work in some of your other courses. So if I would sum up, what the lessons from here, okay, yes, there is attempts to create specialist chambers and to enable judicial learning. There are patterns of reasoning, but the arguments are still quite unpredictable, and there's no upward harmonizing agenda. Okay, so this was quite hard work, because it's a lot of material we have to code. But once we got a taste of it, we thought now we would like to know really on the same kind of big questions, what is the political influence of member states on the court? And that's the next study. So the study, which is it's still in the review process in journals, so it's out there as a working paper. It will come out in the next year, and that's a study about who is steering European jurisprudence. So what we try to do there is to find out whether member states can influence how the court decides. Okay, that's quite important. It's quite important. So again, because it addresses the question: is the court independent, and is it open to kind of political pressures, and how does that work? So I run you through some of these slides, not in as much detail as I've done this. I need to find this slide first. I think I've unplugged this briefly, so forgive me. Okay. Ask me questions if you have any.
I have a question.
Yeah.
As can be seen from the slide, it shows there is a dramatic escalation of preliminary, references to the courts, but maybe it proves that there still exists lots of normative voids. I want to refer to as authority of preliminary references. Yeah, I don't know the authority to every member state. Some commentators just respond to some specific case of preliminary references. Authority to every case,
I'm not entirely sure I understood it. So I think you're right. The fact that there are so many references points to a what we call a normative void.
Yeah.
Normative void means there's uncertainty and kind of a